We're continuing forward on our Problem of Evil series. So last week, again, we didn't get through my entire week 3, which I'm not surprised. And I figure as soon as I jump into some of this, that's going to create a lot of really good discussion, which it did. So let's do a quick review. One, so remember we talked about theodicies, which are answers to these problems. The very first one I had mentioned is character building theodicy. That was 2 weeks ago. That was when even though there's suffering, it allows us to overcome said suffering with greater good. So even though there's evil, we overcome said evil with greater good, right? It allows us to build our soul and our character and our moral integrity. Then I mentioned the heaven theodicy, which is even though there is suffering now, there is a new creation to come where there will be no suffering. And the whole point of perhaps this time is more of a quote-unquote veil of tears, which is the idea of that even though things are difficult now, God purposely created a world where evil was possible, so that way we would know what evil is like apart from God if we choose to disobey Him. So that way in the new creation, we will not fall back into evil, right, with our new bodies and within the new creation. So we'll no longer have evil desires. Then we discuss and criticize the Reformed theodicy, right, which is the idea that all things, that all evil has purpose, and the fact that God commands the evil to display His power and His judgment and His wrath. And many of you guys probably already know this. I'm not a fan of that theodicy. I don't think it's a good one. Then we mentioned the open theism theodicy, which is perhaps maybe God just didn't know that evil would take place. We had a good discussion about that in this room, and then we also kind of criticized it and just mentioned the fact that we here probably don't hold to the open theism theodicy, even though there's many people within the GGF that Frontline is in that are open theists. Then we started jumping into what we call the free will theodicy. So free will theodicy is simply this. The greater good that God intended was to give mankind libertarian freedom, but with that comes the unavoidable consequence of mankind being able to use that freedom for evil or for good. So this is oftentimes called the free will theodicy. So why does evil take place? Well, because God wants to build your character, allows us to actually think about it. How many of you guys have been able to help somebody in their suffering who's experiencing evil, but then is able to show them a greater good? Right? You're able to build somebody up. Okay, then also many of us know we have a hope for a future new creation. So even though we suffer now, it is only temporary, right? And then on top of that, who is to blame? This is a question I asked. There was a young lady in youth group last week. We were talking about a family member of hers who's really struggling with the problem of evil because she's her brother's being bullied at school. And one of the things I talked to her about, because he was saying that he doesn't think God could exist, and yet bullies exist. Because why would God allow for that? But the question is who's really to blame there? Is that God, or is that somebody making an evil choice, right? And if God gave mankind freedom, then we would know. And remember, we said freedom is a moral good. Freedom is good, right? What makes your relationship special is that someone freely chose to engage in that relationship with you, whether marriage or friendships. Those things have to be free, because if they're not free, then they have no meaning whatsoever, right? If someone's forced to be your friend, that's not much of a friend, right? That's, most of my friends are paid actors. I'm very well aware of that, but at least I know. So the free will, and so we kind of talked about that, and then we talked about how natural evil took place is because of sin corrupting creation. So all the evil takes place is not because God made it or caused it. It's because mankind made choices, and then also because our creation was corrupted when Satan corrupted it with the fall. Okay? So that kind of gets us caught up to speed, because then today what I wanted to do was, since we talked about the free will theodicy, now we have to examine free will itself. Okay? And this is a term, free will is used colloquially. Woo, there's a word. Free will is used colloquially to say, usually, if you're in the theology world, they'll define it as the ability to do otherwise. And then, however, yeah, and Jordan's here. He's the one who has me getting to say this more now. The choice to make better or worse response, right? So a better or worse response, because sometimes you can't necessarily also, we'll talk about that. We're going to go forward. Hold on. I'm going to get ahead of myself. So first off, let's talk about the different views of how free will works, okay? So there's one, which is determinism. Determinism is the belief that all things have been determined and there's no freedom of any kind. Your freedom that you think you have is an illusion, okay? And in fact, Dr. Sam Harris, a very popular atheist, wrote a book called The Illusion of the Will. And that is because if there's no freedom of any kind that exists, atheists have to be determinists. I don't know if you guys know this, and atheist philosophers and atheists in general have admitted that they have to be determinists. They cannot believe in free will. And the reason for that is because all that makes up a person in the atheist worldview is what we call naturalism, right? All things happen only naturally. There's no supernatural anything. All things happen naturally. So all children, right? My daughter is a combination of my wife and I, so therefore everything about her is pre-made and preconditioned within her genetic material. Cause and effect creating your nature, and they have nurtured you in a certain way. Have you guys ever heard of the term like nature versus nurture? Okay, so that's essentially what atheists are saying, that you don't have free will. Everything about you is either you have a certain nature you're born with, and then you are nurtured in a certain environment, and that pretty much just shapes exactly who you're going to be, and you don't have free will. You are just basically, if we can use this term, like a wet robot, a meat robot. You are just a nervous system sparking, neurons firing until they end. So are you guys following through on how that would work? So essentially, if you're just nothing but preconditioned genetic material, you have no free will in the atheist worldview. There is no free will. Yes, sir.
Is that according to the atheist, or is that the atheist?
Are you saying are you saying atheists are just that way because they're atheists, or are you saying they determined to be that way?
No.
I think that's what.
Yeah, or they determine us to be that way.
Right. So the atheists would say that that's what they determine all mankind to be. Okay. They think that all mankind is determined by their preconditioned genetic material. But so there is a certain irony, though, because what will happen is that atheists, like Sam Harris and others, will go to debates, and they will debate against somebody that free will does not exist. And they'll be like, nope, free will doesn't exist. They get up here, they give their whole opening statement, and then they debate someone on free will. But the irony here is that whenever anyone who subscribes to determinism enters into a debate, they have already forfeited, right? Because they're acting as though you can freely choose to change your mind based on the force of arguments, right? But if you're determined to think a certain way, you can't do that. Does that make sense?
You can choose to go to the debate or not go to the debate. Is that what you're saying?
Pretty much, yes. So it's like, and that's my seminary professor and president of my seminary, Braxton Hunter, who actually is who I got a lot of these notes from. Dr. Braxton Hunter actually pointed out in his debate with Matt Dillahunty, who's the host of the Atheist Experience, if you guys know that. And so in his opening argument, he goes, he breaks down what atheist determinism is, and he goes, and he said, if you freely chose to come tonight to this debate, God exists. Because otherwise you were determined to do so. And I was like, that's pretty clever. So anyway, so atheists have to be determinists. Cause and effect and all that. So I want you to think of it this way. How many of you guys have seen the movie RoboCop? Really? Okay, good. All right, there's a few of us in here who have seen RoboCop. Now, do you guys remember that in RoboCop, he was already pre-programmed on how he would act and react and even speak, but finds out at the end that there was a chip inside his head that made him have the illusion of choice. That is exactly what determinists would say, is essentially that it's all an illusion. So you are RoboCop, okay? You just missed my RoboCop analogy, Jordan. That's a good one.
Like, what about iRobot?
But you could still argue until you blew in the face because
about
God
supposed
sent
to be
Jesus
deterministic.
here, if everybody would have accepted him as the king that wasn't going to take over, then, you know where I'm going with this.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. This is a hotly, when I say in the philosophy world, this is like one of the most hotly contested issues. I mean, it's really one of the most hotly contested issues. It is.
Been built on.
Yes. So, also, there's kind of this funny thing. A lot of philosophical atheists call themselves free thinkers. How many of you guys have heard atheists of the world say, "I am a free thinker"? You know, you guys follow religion, and I've been told this by many atheists in the various fields. Well, we're free thinkers, and you guys have to be told what to do by the church or by your Bible or whatever. But there's a certain irony there as well, because if atheism is true and all you are is your pre-programmed, conditioned genetic material, then the last thing you ever are is a free thinker, right? Because you really are just whatever you're pre-programmed to be based on your genetics. So you're not really a free thinker. But in determinism, there's no such thing as a free thinker. Even their claim that something is true or untrue can't really be known because they were just determined to think that it is either true or false. They really don't possess the ability to weigh and observe data. Does that make sense? So it is, and here's the thing. Now I've been dunking on more modern and more of the academic sphere of determinism and atheism. However, there are also deterministic Calvinists and Christians. So there's Christians in the Reformed community that hold under determinism. And there's two different types of Calvinists. Some will just hold to determinism outright, and some of them will deny what we're about to talk about, compatibilism. Most Christians who are determinists fall under what we call compatibilists. Most of them, okay? Not all. You will run into somebody who will bite the determinist bullet once in a while. Those are fun. Have you run into those ones?
No, but Luther was.
Yeah. So
I can read you the quote if you want.
Oh yeah. Well, can you find that, or do you have it right there?
Oh yeah.
So Martin Luther.
Yeah. So this is Luther, the conclusion of the bondage of the will. If we believe it to be true that God foreknows and foreordains all things, that he can be neither deceived nor hindered in his prescience and predestination, and that nothing can take place but according to his will, which reason herself is compelled to confess, then, even according to the testimony of reason herself, there can be no free will in man, in angel, or in any creature.
So there you have Martin Luther. This is why I say all the time. So you know how we celebrate Reformation Day on, a lot of people are like Reformation Day on Halloween, which is a kind of irony to it. But what's funny about that is a lot of people don't know or have read Martin Luther or Calvin, some of the reformers, because some of their views are pretty, they're very, very what we'd call almost radical in certain areas. Okay, so there are Christians who also fall under this, which really, so here's the thing. In the atheist worldview, yes, I find determinism problematic, but at least they're being honest by just saying, hey, look, there is no real good, because Dawkins was the one who said basically there is no good or evil, just a world of pitiless indifference. So in the atheist worldview, determinism doesn't really cause a problem because they're going, hey, look, there's no real morality. It is just action and reaction. Everything's pre-programmed. Everything lives and it dies. That's it. So you go, okay. Well, at least that's internally consistent, right? So, but what causes the problem in determinism with Christians is that if everything takes place by God's will and no one else has free will, then we have to say that Satan was decreed by God with no free will to corrupt the earth. That every rapist, every rape ever was by the will of God. That every single child murder was by the will of God. And every single, actually that Jeffrey Dahmer is back in because of the Netflix show. That means that Jeffrey Dahmer was willed by God. And when you really think about that, you go, okay, and then God says, but then in the Bible, God also says, but be holy as I am holy. Then the very question comes up, then what is even holy if you can will and command such things? Right? So the determinism on Christianity causes a lot of problems. In the atheist worldview, I think it causes problems, but not nearly as much as what a Christian claims determinism. Does that make sense? I think it really starts causing some problems. All right. Think of it this way. How many of you guys have ever chosen or been like, maybe not chosen, maybe you're determined, but how many of you guys have ever been like, hey, I'm going to start working out, go home and hop on a treadmill or something like that? How many of you guys have done that? So in determinism, you were pre-programmed to choose the chocolate cake over the treadmill every time. Okay, so that's kind of the idea, because we've all started something and not followed through fully, right? So that would be just something you're predetermined to do. Let's make it more fun. All right, chocolate cake and treadmill is way more fun to talk about than Jeffrey Dahmer, right? So,
How do the people the Christians who believe determinism, respond to what you just said with evil? How do they respond to that? Do they believe God created Satan to be evil? Do they believe
Yep.
God created Jeffrey Dahmer to kill people?
Yep. They will. Christians who do that, they'll just own it and be like, no, I absolutely believe God willed that for a greater purpose. We don't understand his purpose. It's part of his secret will, and they'll call it the secret will of God. And then they will usually ask you, like, but who are you, oh man, to respond back to God? They'll quote Romans 9 kind of out of context. But, like, you can't question God. You just have to be okay with it. And you don't have to, this goes back to that fideism, don't think, just believe kind of a concept, which is like, hey, it seems like it's contradictory, but God is God, and we're man, so you just got to basically shut up and deal with it. Any comment on there, Jordan? Usually you have something on that.
Well, I can read the...
You're like a source machine.
Yeah, I mean, I can read the response to that. So, first, this is Calvin. He says, God ordained the fall of Adam. So, and everything happens according to its will. So, in ordaining the fall of man, especially, God had an end most glorious and most just, an end into our contemplation of which the mention or idea of sin on the part of God can never enter. The very thought of its entrance strikes us with horror. Although, therefore, I thus affirm that God did ordain the fall of Adam, I so assert it as by no means to concede that God was therein properly and really the author of that fall. Wherefore, let us delight ourselves more in wise ignorance than in immoderate and intoxicated curiosity to know more than God permits.
So he calls it wise ignorance to not know.
Says, but how it was that God by his foreknowledge and decree ordained what should take place in Adam, and yet so ordained it without his being himself in the least a participator of the fault, or being at all the author or the approver of the transgression. How this was, I repeat, is a secret, manifestly far too deep to be penetrated by any stretch of human intellect. Here and therefore I am not ashamed to confess my utter ignorance. And far be it from any one of the faithful to be ashamed to confess his ignorance of that, which the Lord God has wholly enveloped in the blaze of his own inaccessible light.
So it took basically
Here's your answer.
the secret will of God.
Don't ask. Believe.
Basically, God is beyond our understanding.
Right,
Yes.
100%. And what it starts off with is that it turns into a faulty premise, which is the idea that everything must take place by the will of God. That's the faulty premise. That God must will every single thing. Well, it's like, well, that's your faulty premise, because in Scripture we see that there's many things that God did not will that people did, right? So there's your faulty premise. But when you come, that remember what we said at the way back, like this was probably last year when we started this class, right? And I said that philosophy comes before theology, and most people were like, "Whoa," but theology is literally a subset of philosophy. If you have a wrong philosophical predisposition towards something or assumption, you're going to come to a wrong theological conclusion. Does that make sense? So that's why when I was saying that, I'm like, but he's coming from Augustine, and Augustine had the same presupposition that had to exist. Everything has to happen by the will of God. So when you have that as your presupposition, you're going to read Scripture and make it fit that way. Does that make sense? So that causes problems. I'm glad that everyone's noticing that. It's like, oh yeah, okay. Maybe Will isn't completely nuts. Little nuts, but not completely nuts. Okay. So now that's determinism. Anything else before I talk about compatibilism? Okay. All right, so compatibilism, shortly defined, would be something like freedom is compatible with determinism, in that man's desires have been acted upon such that he does what he wants, but has no control over what he wants. So here's the thing. Determinism, all things determined by God, no free will exists. Free will, not all things are determined by God, free will exists. Compatibilism says determinism and free will can both be compatible with one another because mankind will act in such a way that he does what he wants, but he has no control over what he wants. So that's the difference, okay? And we'll flesh that out because some people are like, well, okay, what? This goes into the T of total depravity if you're Reformed or you're Calvinistic, which is the fact that you will only desire to do that which is evil, right? Like I will have evil desires and I follow through those evil desires, and I'm unable to choose God because I will never want to choose God because I'm sinful. Therefore, God has to choose me and regenerate me in order for me to choose Him. Okay, that's kind of the short version. All right, so let's go ahead. In a sense, this is what compatibilism is saying. You're pre-programmed to freely act out on your greatest desires, whether to hit the treadmill or eat the chocolate cake. So, when I walk in, I was pre-programmed to want to eat the chocolate cake. So, but I am freely acting out on what I want, even though I was pre-programmed to do it. So I am still, in my mind, freely choosing, even though I was programmed to do otherwise. Does that make sense? I followed to do, pre-programmed to follow through. And I'll give you a good example that will help wrap your brain around this. You guys at the Friday Night Bible Study will have already heard it, though. But anyway, Calvinists have to either be, now here's the thing, Calvinists or Reformed people have to either be determinists or compatibilists. They cannot just hold on to LFW, libertarian free will. They can't do it. Not be consistent. I guess you could if you want to hold a complete contradiction, but they will, every Reformed person on the planet will say they're either compatibilist or determinist straight up. Okay? So, Calvinists have to either be a determinist or a compatibilist, especially to agree with the Westminster Confession that we read 2 weeks ago. So many people seem to want to have libertarian freedom and determinism, but the problem is, with the compatibilism, is that it's a contradiction, right? I am not freely choosing something if I was pre-programmed to choose it, right? It's not a free choice. It's just not. So one cannot punt to mystery on this either. Contradictions are not mysteries, okay? They're just contradictions. And I think we just need to say, hey, no, that's a contradiction, can't do it, right? So they are a paradox. So some people are like, well, no, it's just a paradox. But here's the thing. A paradox only appears to be contradictory on the surface, but aren't once you get under the hood, right? Example of this, Paul says, I was crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live. That's a paradoxical statement, but once you realize he's speaking metaphorically, you realize, oh, that's what he's talking about, right? It's a paradoxical statement, but once you inspect it theologically, you understand what he's saying. So let's talk about your wants. So your wants and desires have been determined by God, but your actions are freely to do whatever you want. So, you do what you want, but what you want was pre-programmed. Now here is, how many of you guys have seen Star Wars? Hey, all right. Yeah. Would you believe how many people haven't seen Star Wars anymore? Like, Dominic, I just had to get him through like the main 6, okay? Just recently. He's like, I've never seen him. I'm like, how do you, what? But, so remember the old Jedi mind trick, right? These aren't the droids you're looking for. He suddenly made the stormtrooper, and the stormtrooper was that they go like into like a whole, I have no idea what happened, and no, he suddenly freely wanted to let them move along, right? Suddenly he changed his mind and his desire. So another great analogy is this. So many of you guys may have wondered how I got such a wonderful wife like Callie to marry me. Well, here's the trick. Yes, I'm a Jedi. So think about it this way. If I was like, oh my goodness, look at her, she's beautiful, I really want to talk to her, but I'm too scared and she'll never love me. So instead, I go to Professor Snape, yes, I'm making a Harry Potter reference, and he teaches me how to make a love potion. And I sneak it into her drink, and she drinks this love potion, and suddenly she falls madly in love with me. So where she was once didn't like me, now her desire is to love me to death. Now she's freely loving me, right? She has a desire to love me, and she's following through with that. However, something external from her caused her to do that. Does that make sense? So, was she really free to love me? No. And if you guys are going, this sounds very scarily close to date rape, you would be correct. Right? It's very similar to that. So this is what we call a date rape drug. It is not what we would say is a free choice, right? So this really isn't freedom. It's simply redefining freedom. Ben?
So going down this road, would you say free will only exists if it's 100% free will then in the LFW idea, like compatibilism isn't actually free will, but people just think it is?
People say it is, and we're going to talk about how Calvin and people get that because they're saying you freely choose. So yeah, I'm also going to say free will, the problem is with this, because they're going to say, well, Adam freely chose to fall, right? Adam freely chose to fall, just God ordained it to happen for him to freely choose to fall. So the problem is when we say free will, a lot of times Reformed or compatibilists in general will say, well, no, I agree. I agree that we have free will. Just we act out on what we were pre-programmed to do. We freely act out on what we were programmed to do, or something along that nature. So instead, I would say only true freedom. I think that I will just be like, no, true freedom, absolute freedom without the external causation at all.
So no pre-programmed, no ordained, just free will.
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, that would be the direction I go. I mean, there's other factors, obviously, disposition, and I do think there's a nature and a nurture thing to discuss in some of those, but in the end, you still have to be able to have true freedom in one way or the other.
Yeah. Important thing to point about compatibilists is that compatibilists say that external, you can't be forced to do something by an external force. So if I grab you and twist your arm behind your back and dunk your head in the water, then that's not free. But if I give you a desire to dunk your head in the water because you think there's a $100 bill at the bottom, wrapped up and stuck in an apple or something, if I give you use internal forces that will determine that you will dunk your head in the water, that was free. Even though you couldn't choose to not dunk your head in the water, either way, external force is coercion, internal force is not coercion.
Right.
Somehow.
Which is why I say it's not truly freedom. Does that make sense? Okay. So if it, but here's the thing. As much as I have a problem with compatibilism, it is able to remain consistent within their own Confession of Westminster, right? Because God creating things shaped toward man's desires, right? So that's what he did. He created things shaped toward man's desires. So God created their will, but the actions were done by the person or the individual. You guys might remember last week I used the hitman analogy, right? Someone could command a hitman to kill someone. Like if I could get Cal to be a hitman to Ed, and you take out Ed, well then Kathy, the lawyer, you were the lawyer last time, you'll be the lawyer this time, and she convicts me, she goes, no, you had him killed. I was like, no, Cal did it. She's like, that doesn't fly here. You were still the one who put the hit out, right? In fact, R.C. Sproul Jr., I just read it myself, R.C. Sproul Jr., a really large, well-known Calvinist, used the hitman analogy to defend himself. And I, by the way, I had never read that before until just yesterday. And I was like, I literally used that analogy last week. No one could accuse me of straw manning. Okay? Because literally the Calvinist said so. I was actually like, wow, that's cool. All right. So anyway, because remember, Westminster Confession says this: God, from all eternity did, by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will, freely and unchangeably ordain whatsoever comes to pass, so as yet thereby neither is God the author of sin, nor is violence offered by the will of the creature, nor is the liberty or contingency of second causes taken away, but rather established. So again, God caused them to desire things. Okay? So this is why Reformed people cannot consistently use what we would consistently use a free will defense. But that's why, because of the confusion, it's better to just say true freedom or something like that, really clarify your terms, because otherwise you're going to end up arguing semantics and definitions rather than getting to the actual issue at hand. Okay? If they can't use the free will defense, then they must admit that God either decreed something like rape or decreed the desires that lead to someone raping. However, they can also say that there's quote-unquote purpose in it. Because remember, one of the complaints about the problem of evil is that there's gratuitous evil, evil without purpose. So at least in the Calvinist worldview, they can say everything has a purpose. It's just by the secret will of God. Don't think, just believe. So they at least have that. There's purpose in it. which I don't know what that sort of purpose that would be, but here we are. Now, I really quickly want to talk about libertarian freedom. I think because we've talked so much around these, actually real quick, any comments on compatibilism?
What do they say about God cannot be tempted, or nor does he tempt anyone?
That's a great question. Actually, I don't know what they would say to that, because I've never heard a good answer. Because usually it's always dodge into the secret will. Like, that's my issue with it, where I'm like, well, it seems like we are creating biblically inconsistent views.
Yeah, so on that point, they would say you're already fallen. God doesn't have to tempt you to do it, because
that's right.
you already have the desire, because you have a fallen nature. You already have the desire to do the evil. So God doesn't have to externally force you to do the evil, because you already have that internal desire, so you already do it.
So God doesn't tempt you, he just makes you want to be tempted.
And where's the devil in all this?
Right.
That's a great question, Dan. I'm with you. Because that's my thing. We're like, well, then what's the point of the devil? If God does it all himself, what is the point of the devil?
Compatibilism works very well on fallen creatures. Where the inconsistency comes is when you take compatibilism and you apply it to Adam before the fall. Because after the fall, you can just say, well, you have evil desires, so you just naturally choose it. And God isn't forcing you to do it, but he allows you or ordains you or wills you to do. He passes over giving you a good desire. Therefore, he wanted you or willed you to do the evil thing, but you naturally did it, so you're responsible for it.
But how do they explain that after you're saved? I can get that, but our Life Center learnings, your spirit has changed. You're joined with Christ.
Mm-hmm.
You are seated at the right hand of Christ. You are no longer, a sinful nature. You are now a righteous, and that's in the Bible. And
Mm-hmm.
so how do they explain that after a salvation experience? Because we still sin, but we have the nature of righteousness.
Yeah, I'm guessing they just go to Paul where he says he still has the old man. The things he doesn't want to do, he does.
Yeah, Romans 7.
Things he does want to do, he doesn't do.
And they would say because God regenerated you, so God gave you new desires for righteousness that you couldn't have before when he saved you. So again, because salvation is of God entirely, so he uses his grace irresistibly. You didn't have a choice, and he unconditionally elected you, right? So he chose you before the foundations of the world to be saved, gives you this new desire for righteousness. And now but you still have that sin, that guilt from Adam with you. So now it's going to be the spirit versus the flesh until God makes all things new. But you are now chosen and elected with the new desires to pursue God. And believe me when I say it doesn't make, I can tell because all of us are like, but how do you square the? What? Honestly, I think it is actually very counterintuitive, which is why it's funny because I actually saw a guy say. That Calvinism, I just saw a tweet, it went all over the place online. Calvinism is like black coffee. When you first try it, it tastes disgusting, but the more you drink it, the more you love it. And I was like, but the whole point of that is, of course, the more you're convinced by a certain belief and push that on yourself, you're going to be more and more convinced of it and think it's better and better, correct? So, again, I disagree, but these are the main views. But
Just drink the Kool-Aid, man.
Just drink the Kool-Aid, man. Don't think, just believe.
It's why John Piper wrote a book called The Justification of God. Because when you hear all of this and you're like, God ordained Adam to fall and he couldn't do otherwise than what God ordained, how do you justify that God doing that, right?
Yeah.
So there's books.
How can God be good?
So we write books.
Oh, hold on. So she's very tired and this morning was a rough morning. So anyway, now let's do some discussion on free will itself.
What about with the plagues and Pharaoh and how it said God hardened his heart and wouldn't let them go?
So that's actually a great question because that's what they will bring up. They will talk about God hardened hearts. So if you look at it, first off, Pharaoh hardened his heart over and over again. He continually hardened his heart. So then what God essentially does here is when you have a people who are completely rebellious, is that God has a tendency to go, you want to be rebellious? Okay. And so the word hardened in Hebrew, it's not the best way to put it. It means like bolstered or strengthened. And it's a directional term. So God essentially strengthened his resolve. And I was like, okay, great. You want to keep rebelling? I'm going to strengthen your resolve, and I'm going to show you as an example of all the nations of what happens when you rise up against me. And now I will free my people from you. And it's actually funny because that's actually the exact example that we're constantly hear about of how Jesus Christ freed us from the clutches of Satan. Is that he's essentially now going to raise up Satan and destroy him at the end, the way he did Egypt. So that's kind of what they do, where it's like God's bolstering. And now that's the thing, is like if you're rebellious, it doesn't mean that God's causing you to do that, but God might bolster your resolve. And just be like, all right, because that's the hardening. We see the idea of judicial hardening in Scripture regularly, right? God is like, okay, that's how these people are. But like, how did he do that with Israel? Jesus spoke in parables, right? He's purposely spoken parables. Why? Because due to the hardness of their heart, essentially, they weren't going to listen to him. So he's like, I purposely have kept the truth a bit more veiled, so only those who really are listening and hearing my voice will come to me. And the rest of them will be not part of this because they have hardened themselves. So it's a judicial hardening. It's a way of going, you've chosen this path, so now you are going to receive the judgment of it. Does that make sense? It's an easier way to put that. Okay.
The Pharaoh thing is when it says God hardened his heart, it helps if you think about that the Hebrew language only has 4,000 words that are like our everyday words. When you add in place names and all that stuff, you get to around 8,000 words. But, I mean, we use over 10,000 words in the English language. You know, I mean, and it's way more than that, just everyday use. Most people know over 10,000 words, but they have 4,000 words to work with. So when it says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, it's saying that Pharaoh had already chosen what he wanted to do, but he didn't have the courage to act on it. So God gave him the courage to act on the choice that Pharaoh had already made. So instead of reading it as God hardened Pharaoh's heart, what I think it means is that Pharaoh didn't want to let them go. That was his choice, and God gave him the courage to keep them.
That makes, that's a good way. It has like the bolstered idea, right? The bolstered and the strengthened.
Yeah.
Good call. Okay. So, now here's the thing with when you say libertarian freedom, some people get this really strange view of libertarian freedom, which is if I will it, it happens. Like I can will to jump over a 10-story building. So that's obviously not what most people nowadays mean when they hear the word free will, but I just want to let you guys know that that is actually technically the original definition of libertarian free will. Okay, like that. If you go way back, that's what a lot of people defined it as, like willing anything. So certain people call themselves, like Braxton Hunter, at my seminary, he calls himself the soft libertarian because he's like, I don't believe it, like some of those things, right? So, but here's the thing, only the free will theodicy, or the true freedom theodicy, if we can use that term, or one of the others combined with the free will theodicy really escapes criticism that God is the source of evil, okay? It's the only way you can really, so mankind had to have a choice. So you get to choose, so in this theodicy, you actually do get to choose between the cake or the treadmill, all right? You weren't pre-programmed to do so. You weren't determined by your nature versus nurture. And this one, you get to walk in and go, am I going to run on that treadmill, or am I going to eat chocolate cake? And if you're me, you want to eat that chocolate cake. All right, so, all right. And so soft libertarian, I should say, also means that you are still influenced by things like your desires. And I don't think any of us would deny that, right? We have influence by desires and some things that are easier or not as easy. So I think that's an okay way to go.
Can I just say,
yes.
you have determinism on one side and libertarian as the opposite. So for it to be libertarian free will, it has to be free of all determinism. So when somebody says they're soft libertarian, what they're saying is that, like when God created Adam in the garden, Adam didn't determine where he would be created. Adam didn't determine what the test of obedience would be. Adam didn't determine that God would create Eve, right? So there's Adam's environment wasn't chosen by him. That was determined by God. So soft libertarianism is that, like Will was saying, your environment, Adam's environment wasn't determined by him. Something else determined that he would be in that environment.
Just like I didn't freely choose to be born in Grand Rapids.
Right. So that's not your it wasn't your libertarian choice to choose where you would be born or the circumstances you're in. But soft libertarian means that when you are given a choice, like God said to Adam, you are free to eat from any tree, but do not eat from this one, that Adam really had the ability to choose to take the fruit or to choose to not disobey God. So Adam really had the real freedom of that choice. Versus in compatibilism, they say that it could not be otherwise. Adam had to fall because God willed it and ordained it. So you can't say that Adam's choice of whether to obey or disobey was really his choice, because it was determined by God. It wasn't his choice wasn't free of determinism. So I think soft libertarianism, at least as I understand it and explaining that way, I think that's true. It's defensible.
Mm-hmm. I would agree.
That it really was Adam's he really had the freedom to go either way.
Right. So and that goes back into the whole, because if God sent like an army of monkeys to eat all the fruit off the tree to prevent Adam from eating of the tree, right? Well, if he did that, then Adam wasn't really free to choose. The choice was robbed from him. Does that make sense? So if God did that, he'd actually go back on his own word of giving him the freedom, right? So it'd make God a liar, because he gave him freedom but then robbed him of it. So so then I really quickly want to mention these. So we have risk-taking theodicy versus risk-free theodicy. So compatibilism and determinism is what we would call a risk-free theodicy. And by risk, we mean basically control. So taking a risk doesn't mean you give up knowing, right? Sometimes we take a risk and we know what the risk is. But taking a risk means giving up control. And so in a free will theodicy, actually, God is risk-taking. He's giving up absolute, complete control over everything, and he's allowing his free creatures to make decisions. Does that make sense? So I would say that otherwise, God took zero risk. And C.S. Lewis says something about that too. Wasn't he? I don't know if you have that quote off the top of your head, because sometimes you have those.
I don't have that one.
Oh!
Off the top of my head.
Come on, Dr. Farrier, what is this?
I can find it in 5 minutes at home.
So God took a risk by giving mankind freedom, okay? Because he gave up control over all those things. Which is why he put the stewardship into mankind's hands, right? This is the earth. Be a steward of the earth, right? Be a good caretaker. And then when it comes to Adam's fall, Jordan already touched on this, but the question was it contingent or was it necessary? Did Adam fall by necessity? Well, if his determinism compatibilism is true, he fell by necessity, right? He fell necessarily. However, we would say he fell contingently. But contingent on what? On God's choice, like compatibilism says? Or on man's choice? I would say on man's choice, right? It was contingent on man's choice. So then we have this idea of choice versus act, okay? So Adam had the real freedom to choose and the real freedom to act. Because in compatibilism, they would say that he only had the freedom really to act, not really to choose, right? Okay. So, and then I thought this will help a little bit. So you can, if you anyone want to ask, what do you mean by free will or whatever, you can say the ability to do otherwise, the ability for better or worse response. Those are good ways to define it. But if you want to get technical, you could say the will is often what acts, right? Because think about it. Have you guys ever made a choice but were unable to follow through out of fear? You made the choice, but you couldn't move. Think of, so I actually think of your story in your email reminded me of this last night. In college, we would go to this lake that had this gigantic cliff edge, and they had this rope that some people installed, and you could run, grab the rope, and swing off into the lake. And you'd drop like 30 feet and splash. It was awesome. But I remember I made the choice like 3 times. I'm going to do it. But then I couldn't follow through, right? I made the choice, but I couldn't follow through until I finally was like, all right, you're going to do it. Man up. And then I did it. And it was awesome. And I kept doing it. So the thing is that the intellect is often what chooses. And the will is often the very thing that acts. However, you can also say there's influences from your feelings and things like that. And all that, we can really get that. If you really want to start breaking this down, you can. And get kind of pedantic over the situation. Most people don't want to get that pedantic, but it can actually help you. You're like, well, have you ever willed something but was unable to act out on it? I have, right? Has anyone else, right? Does that sound like the human experience? Right, okay. So I want to make sure I'm not crazy here. So this, the will often acts upon the choice, right? And many confuse choice with will. It's kind of a shell game that they play, the Calvinists especially. So that's something I really wanted to make sure we broke down for a minute. And then I have 2 seconds, and I'm just going to go over real fast one last theodicy, and then we can talk, okay? Then one last theodicy for you, the physics theodicy. So if God changed things or forced things to take place to avoid suffering or evil, then it would prevent us from knowing the natural world, because the natural world would be ever changing. Because some people are like, well, why did God not stop that fire? Why couldn't God have turned the fire into just smoke and made it dissipate or whatever? For example, though, we would not be able to actually know how our world would be and how to interact with the world and how to be safe in our world and how to understand our world, because it would be ever-changing. For example, like turning a guardrail into rubber to prevent someone from crashing. If God just kept changing things, and we live in that he'd be the ultimate helicopter parent, never allowing anything bad to happen, and we would actually have no way of knowing the world we live in. Does that make sense? So then, therefore, again, this is a good way to respond to that. It's not a complicated theodicy. It's just something for you guys to keep in mind. Yes?
So would this be like more New Testament versus Old Testament, where he does a lot of changing of like different things, where like he holds the sun in place and like the separating of
turning a rod into a serpent, things like that.
So
yeah, I would say that's a distinction between a miracle versus the natural world. Mm-hmm. So miracles by their definition are not regular instances, right? And you'll notice that most of the time miracles take place when God is displaying his power or trying to reveal himself in some way, especially to Israel. There's a reason why Jesus came doing signs, right? He did signs because he was going, hello, Jews, Israel, I'm Messiah. I am Messiah. And then we see him do the same thing with Egypt, right? I'm showing you signs. I'm the true God of Israel. Then he keeps calling back to that. But we don't see him constantly doing those things, only to keep proving himself to Israel. So, yes, he does change things, but he only does it in particular senses, in a miracle sense, which is by definition rare. And does that make sense? Yeah. So if it happened regularly, it would make things next to impossible. But that's also what makes them stand. Yeah, I know. I'm wondering while I'm banging around is too. What are we doing to the children?
What are the children doing to?
Yeah, or what are the children doing to the workers is a better question. So, all right. After this, guys, part 4 is the logical argument from evil. We're going to discuss that. So now that we're armed with our theodicies and how to respond to some of these questions, it allow us to work through the actual problem of evil fully, now that we have some answers. Does that make sense?
yes.
Very good. All right. We're really interactive. Okay, cool. Thank you, guys. And feel free to comment or whatever. We can discuss.